Picture this: a newborn baby, minutes old, torn from its mother's arms and carried to a council of old men. They strip it naked, turn it over, inspect every limb, every curve of the spine. They're looking for flaws, any sign of weakness, and if they find one, the child is carried to a cliff and left to die in the cold. This isn't fiction. This was policy. This was Sparta. If you enjoy these dark history deep dives, leave a like and subscribe, and comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach across the world. We remember Sparta for its warriors, the 300 who held the pass at Thermopylae, the discipline, the legendary toughness, but we forget how those warriors were made. The Spartan war machine didn't start with training camps or battle drills. It started in bedrooms, where the state dictated who would sleep with whom. It continued at birth, where committees decided which babies deserved to live. It intensified at age 7, when children were ripped from their families and subjected to brutality we can barely comprehend. The Spartans didn't raise soldiers, they engineered them. And the blueprint was so dark, so systematic in its cruelty, that it makes every dystopian novel you've ever read seem tame by comparison. Because here's what they understood. If you want to build the perfect weapon, you don't start with a teenager. You start before conception. You control who breeds with whom. You eliminate the weak before they take their first step. You sever every human bond that might interfere with absolute loyalty to the state. They succeeded. For 3 centuries, Sparta produced warriors that terrified the ancient world. But the cost? They had to destroy what it means to be human. Let me take you back to where it really began. Not on a battlefield, in a bedroom controlled by bureaucrats. You're a young Spartan, maybe 20 years old. You've never chosen anything for yourself. Not your education, not your friends, not where you live, and you certainly won't choose who you marry. That decision was made in a room you'll never enter, by men whose names you might not even know. The magistrates, the geronts, had been watching you since you were a child. They tracked your lineage like breeders track pedigrees. Who was your father? How did he perform in battle? What about your grandfather? Your uncles? They weren't interested in your personality, your hopes, your preferences. They were interested in your genetic profile, though they wouldn't have used those words. They did the same calculation for the women. Wide hips suggested easier childbirth. Athletic build indicated health. Fair skin, symmetrical features. These weren't aesthetic preferences. They were interpreted as markers of genetic fitness. The magistrates approached matchmaking the way a modern scientist might approach breeding racehorses. Optimize for speed, strength, endurance. Eliminate variables that might produce weakness. When they made their decision, there was no courtship, no getting to know each other. You were informed you'd be marrying someone, often a stranger. The wedding ceremony itself was bizarre, almost violent. The groom would abduct his bride in a staged kidnapping. She'd be taken to a room where her head would be shaved, her body dressed in men's clothing. Then the groom would sneak in from his barracks, consummate the marriage in darkness, and leave before dawn. Why the strange ritual? To prevent emotional attachment. The Spartan state had figured something out. Love is a competing loyalty. A man who loves his wife might hesitate to die for his country. A man who barely knows his wife, who sees her only in brief furtive encounters, he'll march to his death without looking back. But the system went further than arranged marriages. Much further. Imagine you're a decorated warrior. You've proven yourself in combat. The state values you. But your wife, chosen for you by the magistrates, hasn't conceived. Or maybe she's given birth to weak children, sickly infants who didn't pass inspection. Meanwhile, across the city, there's another woman. Strong, healthy, excellent bloodline. But she's married to an older man, or perhaps someone less distinguished than you. In any other society, you'd be stuck. Marriage vows are sacred. Adultery is shameful. But this is Sparta, where the traditional rules of morality have been rewritten. The state has a solution, and it's as cold as it is pragmatic. They'd arrange for you to sleep with that other man's wife, not secretly, not shamefully, openly, with permission, sometimes with encouragement. This wasn't about passion or desire, it was breeding protocol. The state believed that strong warriors and healthy women would produce superior children, and marriage certificates were just paperwork. If a particular genetic combination wasn't producing results, they'd try a different combination. The husband whose wife was borrowed for breeding often consented, even approved, because a strong child, regardless of biological paternity, brought honor to his household and strength to Sparta. Think about what this does to the concept of family. Paternity became uncertain. Fidelity became irrelevant. Children belonged not to parents, but to the state. The most intimate human relationship, the bond between parent and child, was deliberately weakened, systematically undermined, because the Spartans understood that family loyalty could compete with state loyalty, and they couldn't allow that competition. The women in this system occupy a strange space in history. Some modern writers want to portray Spartan women as empowered, as proto-feminists who enjoyed freedoms denied to women elsewhere in Greece. And there's truth there. Spartan women were educated, they owned property, they trained athletically while women in Athens were kept in seclusion. But call it what it was, they were breeding stock given, enough freedom to optimize their biological function. They trained not for personal fulfillment, but to strengthen their bodies for childbirth. They learned to read and manage estates because Spartan men were always away at war, and someone needed to maintain the household infrastructure. They were fed well and encouraged to exercise because malnourished, weak women produce malnourished, weak children. The state had calculated that investing in women's health was investing in military strength. It was efficient, it was logical, it was utterly dehumanizing, and these women internalized the ideology completely. They were taught from girlhood that their worth was measured by the quality of soldiers they produced. Mothers who gave birth to cowards were shamed. Mothers who gave birth to heroes were celebrated. The famous Spartan phrase, "come back with your shield or on it," wasn't just warrior bravado. It was mothers telling sons that death was preferable to dishonor. Ancient sources tell us about a Spartan woman who killed her own son when she learned he'd fled from battle. Whether that story is literally true or propaganda doesn't matter. What matters is that Spartans told that story with approval, not horror. They had successfully replaced maternal instinct with fanatical patriotism. So you've been matched with a stranger. You've consummated a marriage you didn't choose. And now, 9 months later, your wife is in labor. In any normal society, this would be a moment of joy, anticipation, hope. But in Sparta, birth is just the beginning of evaluation. The baby emerges, takes its first breath, and immediately, before the mother can even hold it, the infant is taken away. Not to a nursery, to a committee, the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. These are the oldest, hardest men in Sparta. They've survived countless battles. They've watched friends die, they've killed, and now they're going to decide whether your newborn deserves to live. They unwrap the baby, turn it over, examine it with clinical detachment. Are the legs straight? Is the spine properly formed? Does it cry with appropriate vigor? Any deformity, any perceived weakness, any indication that this child might not become a functional soldier is a death sentence. This wasn't considered cruelty. In Spartan logic, it was necessity. Sparta was a small warrior elite surrounded by enemies. They were vastly outnumbered by the helots, enslaved peoples who worked Spartan land and hated their masters. Every Spartan citizen had to be a pillar of strength. A weak individual wasn't just a burden, it was a liability, a crack in the wall that enemies could exploit. So they eliminated weakness at the source, before it could consume resources, before it could compromise the collective. If the baby passed inspection, it was returned to the family, assigned a plot of land, welcomed not as a child but as a future soldier. But if the verdict was negative, if the elders deemed it unfit, the process was chilling in its bureaucratic coldness. The infant was carried to Mount Taygetus, to a place called the Apothetai, literally the deposits, a deep chasm in the rock, and there the baby was left. No sword thrust, no merciful ending, just abandonment, left to exposure, to cold, to wild animals. A slow death, out of sight and out of mind. The Spartans didn't consider this murder. They considered it quality control, returning defective material to nature, a sacrifice to ensure the strength of the whole. Modern archaeologists have searched for evidence of the Apothetai. They've found remains at the base of cliffs near Sparta, bones of children and adults both. The historical reality is murkier than the legend. Some scholars now think the practice was exaggerated by Sparta's enemies, or that it was reserved for extreme cases rather than routine. But whether it happened to every weak infant or only some, the ideology behind it is undeniable. Spartan children had to earn the right to live, and surviving that first inspection was only the beginning. For 7 years you're raised at home. But don't mistake this for a normal childhood. Spartan parents weren't encouraged to coddle their children. Mothers were taught to suppress tenderness, to treat their sons as state property on temporary loan. Fathers were mostly absent, living in military barracks even after marriage. At age 7, the state came to collect its investment, the Agoge. The word means upbringing, but that's like calling a meat grinder a food processor. Technically accurate, but missing the essential violence. Imagine you're that 7-year-old child. One day men arrive at your home. They're not there to visit, they're there to take you. Your mother doesn't fight them, she doesn't weep. She's been trained for this moment her entire life. She hands you over without protest because protesting would mark her as weak, as insufficiently devoted to Sparta. You're marched to a barracks. From this moment until you're 30 years old, this will be your home. Not a house, not a family dwelling, a military facility. You'll sleep on a bed of reeds you gathered yourself from the river. You'll wear one thin tunic regardless of season, scorching summer or freezing winter, and you'll be hungry. Constantly, gnawingly hungry. The food rations are deliberately insufficient. This isn't an oversight or budget limitation, it's policy. They're keeping you on the edge of starvation for a reason. Because hungry children are motivated children, and the Agoge has a lesson to teach you about how to solve that hunger. Steal. Not as punishment, not as deviance, as curriculum. Spartan instructors expected, demanded, that you supplement your rations through theft. You were supposed to sneak into the city at night, infiltrate homes and farms, take food without being detected. This wasn't about the food. It was about cultivating skills a soldier needs. Stealth, cunning, reconnaissance, the ability to survive behind enemy lines. But here's the twist that reveals the true psychological architecture of the system. If you got caught stealing, you were savagely beaten, whipped until you couldn't stand. The pain was real, the scars permanent. But you weren't being punished for stealing. You were being punished for getting caught, for incompetence. The crime wasn't the theft, it was the failure to execute it properly. Think about what this teaches. Morality isn't about right and wrong, it's about success and failure. There's no inherent virtue or vice in your actions, only outcomes matter. If you achieve your objective, you're praised. If you fail, you're destroyed. This is the mindset of an apex predator. Rules are for the weak. Victory justifies everything. There's a famous story that illustrates this principle perfectly. A Spartan boy stole a fox and hid it under his cloak. When questioned by his instructors, the fox began biting and clawing at his stomach. Rather than reveal the theft, rather than admit he'd been caught, the boy stood there answering questions while the fox literally disemboweled him. He died without making a sound. The Spartans told this story with pride. Not horror, pride. This child died rather than admit failure, and they held him up as an ideal. This is what they were creating. Humans who would endure any pain, any humiliation, any death rather than show weakness. Humans for whom lying, stealing and killing were virtues if they served the state's interests. But physical hardship was only one blade in the Agoge's arsenal. The real battlefield was psychological. Our word laconic, meaning someone of few words, comes from Laconia, the region around Sparta. That's not coincidence. Spartan boys were trained to weaponize language, to treat every word as ammunition that shouldn't be wasted. Instructors would pepper them with questions constantly. Difficult questions, tricky questions, questions designed to expose ignorance or hesitation. Who is the bravest citizen in Sparta? What do you think of the king's strategy in the last campaign? Is theft a virtue or a vice? There were no right answers. The questions were traps. The instructors were looking for weakness, doubt, confusion, a moment of uncertainty. And when they found it, punishment was immediate. Often the instructor would bite the boy's thumb, a sharp pain to drive home the lesson. Think before you speak. Every word must be precise, every response calculated. This created a culture of extreme verbal economy. Spartans became famous throughout Greece for their clipped, cutting remarks. When Philip of Macedon sent a message threatening, "If I invade Laconia, I will destroy Sparta," the Spartans sent back a single word: if. That's not just wit, it's the product of a childhood where every unnecessary syllable could result in pain. But the instructors weren't the only threat. The real daily terror came from your peers. The Agoge was structured as a pyramid of abuse. Older boys, the Irenes, had absolute authority over younger ones. They were drill sergeants, wardens, and torturers rolled into one. They could demand answers, inflict punishments, create arbitrary rules, and they used this power liberally. Meals became interrogations. The Irenes would fire questions at younger boys, not seeking information, but seeking failure. A wrong answer, a slow response. Any sign of weakness would trigger immediate humiliation, public mockery, physical violence, social ostracism. This wasn't bullying in the sense we understand it. It was institutionalized, sanctioned, deliberately designed psychological warfare. The system was teaching boys to function under extreme pressure, to think clearly when stressed, to identify and exploit weakness in others while never showing their own. It fostered paranoia, hypervigilance, a constant state of defensive alertness. You couldn't trust anyone. Your brothers in the barracks were also your evaluators, your potential punishers. The boy next to you might be your comrade in battle someday, but today he's looking for any excuse to hurt you, to elevate himself by dragging you down. This created men who were socially sophisticated but emotionally stunted. They could navigate complex hierarchies, read subtle cues, deploy cutting rhetoric. But they couldn't form genuine emotional bonds. Trust was weakness, vulnerability was suicide. And then there was the annual ritual that sealed the psychological conditioning, the festival at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Artemis wasn't the gentle goddess of Disney cartoons. In Sparta, she was Orthia, the upright one, the harsh one, a primal deity of wilderness and survival, and the ritual in her honour was a baptism of blood. Cheese was placed on the goddess's altar. The objective seemed simple: grab as much cheese as you could. But between you and the altar stood a gauntlet of older boys wielding whips, not symbolic whips, actual leather whips that could tear flesh. To reach the cheese, you had to run through that corridor of pain, whips cutting across your back, your arms, your face. The goal wasn't to avoid the whips. That was impossible. The goal was to endure them without reaction. No screaming, no crying, no flinching. Show pain, and you failed. Show fear, and you're finished. The greatest honour was to stand there, whip striking again and again with a smile on your face. The ancient historian Plutarch claimed he witnessed boys die under the lash still smiling, because dying was preferable to showing weakness. Whether that specific detail is true or exaggerated doesn't change the essential function of the ritual. It was the final exam, proof that the Agoge had successfully burned away every trace of normal human response to suffering. Pain no longer triggered the retreat instinct. It triggered pride. They'd created something that only superficially resembled a human being. By the time you reached your late teens, you were a weapon. Physically hardened to the point where hunger, cold, and pain were background noise. Psychologically conditioned to suppress fear, emotion, and independent thought. Morally recalibrated to value only collective strength and personal victory. But the state had one more test, the darkest one, the one that ancient historians wrote about in whispers that even other Greeks found disturbing. The Krypteia, the secret police. This wasn't a military unit. They didn't fight in formation, didn't march in phalanxes. The Krypteia operated in shadows, and their mission was domestic terrorism. To understand the Krypteia, you need to understand Sparta's fundamental paranoia. They were a tiny warrior elite ruling over a massive enslaved population. The Helots, agricultural slaves who worked Spartan land, outnumbered them 10-1, maybe more. These weren't foreign captives. They were Greeks, people from neighbouring regions conquered by Sparta. They spoke Greek, worshipped Greek gods, and remembered freedom. And they hated their masters with an intensity that kept every Spartan leader awake at night. The existential fear of Helot revolt shaped everything about Spartan society. The Agoge, the constant military training, the obsession with toughness. All of it was aimed at maintaining control over a vastly larger population that wanted them dead. So how do you keep that population subjugated? Terror. Constant, unpredictable, overwhelming terror. And the instrument of that terror was the Krypteia. Here's how it worked. The most promising graduates of the Agoge, the smartest, the most ruthless, the most capable, were selected for this final phase of education. They were sent out into the countryside alone. No armour, no supplies beyond minimal rations, just a dagger. Their orders were simple. Hide during the day, move only at night, and kill Helots. But not random Helots. Not indiscriminate slaughter. They were told to target the strongest, the smartest, the proudest. Any helot who showed signs of leadership potential, any helot who stood a little taller, spoke a little more confidently, who other helots might follow in a rebellion. Cut down the tall poppies. That was the agricultural metaphor they used. Don't let any slave rise above the rest. Keep them leaderless, demoralized, broken. This was the final exam. Could you kill a man who'd done nothing to you? A man who was unarmed, probably in his own home or field? Could you do it from behind, in darkness, with no honor and no glory? Could you commit murder not from rage or self-defense, but from cold strategic calculation? If you could, you were ready. You'd proven you could suppress every human instinct, empathy, fairness, proportionality. You were a tool the state could use without hesitation. The young men who participated in the Crypteia would return to their barracks with blood on their hands and nothing in their hearts. They'd killed because the state ordered it, and the state had provided legal cover for their actions. Every year, when the ephors, Sparta's highest magistrates, took office, they performed a bureaucratic ritual. They formally declared war on the helot population. Just a declaration. A piece of administrative paperwork. But its implications were monstrous. With that declaration, every helot ceased being a slave and became an enemy combatant. Killing them was no longer murder under Spartan law. It was a legitimate act of war. The young men of the Crypteia weren't assassins. They were soldiers operating behind enemy lines, eliminating threats. They'd created a legal fiction to permit systematic murder, bureaucratized atrocity. Now imagine you've survived all of this. You passed inspection as an infant. You endured the Agoge. You proved yourself in the Crypteia. You've killed for the state. At age 30, you're finally allowed to leave the barracks, to have something resembling a private life. But your duty isn't finished. The state needs more weapons, and you're going to manufacture them. Marriage, reproduction, the cycle beginning again. By 30, Spartan men were granted a concession. They could live with their wives instead of sneaking visits in the night. But don't mistake this for domesticity. These weren't homes in any meaningful sense. They were production facilities for the next generation of soldiers, and the woman waiting for you? She's been prepared just as carefully as you have. While you were in the Agoge, she was undergoing her own indoctrination. Spartan girls were unique in ancient Greece. While women in Athens were kept in seclusion, barely educated, Spartan women received formal training. They learned to read, write, manage estates. They underwent rigorous physical conditioning, running, wrestling, javelin throwing. This seems progressive until you understand the reason. They weren't being educated for personal fulfillment. They were being optimized for breeding. The logic was straightforward. Strong mothers produce strong children. So they fed girls well, built their bodies, strengthened their frames. They were creating the perfect incubator for warrior sons. But the physical conditioning was paired with psychological conditioning even more intense than what the boys received. Girls were taught to suppress maternal instinct, to replace it with patriotic fervour. Their worth was measured entirely by the quality of soldiers they produced for the state. Spartan women became famous, or infamous, for their coldness. The mother handing her son his shield with the command, "Return with it or on it." The mother who, upon hearing her son survived a battle but fled like a coward, allegedly killed him with her own hands. The mother who, when told all 5 of her sons died in battle, responded, "Did we win?" These stories might be exaggerations, but they were told with approval, not horror. They represented the ideal Spartan mother, one who loved Sparta more than her own children. When a man and woman like this were brought together, the result wasn't a family. It was a military contract. The wedding ceremony reflected this. The groom kidnapped his bride in a ritualized abduction. Her head was shaved. She was dressed in men's clothing and left alone in a dark room. The groom would arrive, consummate the marriage quickly, and leave before dawn. The strange ritual served a purpose: prevent emotional attachment, keep the encounters brief and infrequent enough that desire remained high, increasing chances of conception, but prevent the comfort and familiarity that might create competing loyalties. Once pregnant, the woman's duty intensified. She wasn't just carrying a child, she was carrying state property. Her diet, her exercise, her entire life was oriented around producing the healthiest possible infant. And when that infant was born, When she went through the pain of labor and delivery, she knew what awaited. The moment of birth wasn't joy, it was judgment. The baby would be taken from her arms and carried to the elders for inspection. If it passed, she'd see it again. If it failed, she might never know what happened to it. Just that it was gone, returned to the state that had lent it to her briefly. And she was expected to accept this without question, because she was Spartan, and Spartans didn't weep for the weak. For 3 centuries, this system functioned with terrifying efficiency. Sparta sat atop the Greek world, its warriors unmatched, its reputation for invincibility seemingly unshakable. They defeated Athens in the Peloponnesian War, becoming the dominant power in Greece. The machine worked. The breeding program produced generation after generation of elite soldiers. But the machine had fatal flaws built into its very design. The first crack was demographic. Every dead Spartan was irreplaceable. Think about it. Each Spartan warrior represented 30 years of investment. Selected before birth from optimal genetic stock, inspected as an infant, trained from age 7 through the most brutal conditioning program ever devised. You couldn't just conscript replacements from the general population the way other Greek cities could. Every Spartan who died in battle was the end product of a 3-decade production pipeline, and they were dying. Despite their skill, despite their training, wars killed Spartans, sometimes in large numbers. Even their victories came at a cost they could barely afford. The Battle of Thermopylae might be remembered as a glorious last stand, but it was also the permanent loss of 300 of Sparta's finest warriors, men who would never father children, never pass on their genetics, never train the next generation. The population of full Spartan citizens, the homoioi, the equals, began a slow but inexorable decline, from perhaps 8,000 or more in Sparta's early period to fewer than 1,000 by the time of their final collapse. They were breeding themselves into extinction through the very wars their system was designed to win. The second flaw was rigidity. The Agoge produced phenomenal hoplites, heavily armoured infantry who fought in dense phalanx formations. Within that narrow tactical framework, they were unbeatable. But the Agoge didn't produce tactical innovators or strategic thinkers. It produced conformists who excelled at executing established doctrine, but struggled to adapt when circumstances changed. Their education deliberately suppressed creativity. Boys who questioned were punished. Boys who proposed novel solutions were beaten down. The system rewarded those who perfectly embodied existing standards, not those who imagined new possibilities. So as warfare evolved around them, as tactics became more flexible, as cavalry and light infantry grew more important, as siegecraft and naval power reshaped Greek warfare, Sparta remained locked into their traditional methods. They were the perfect answer to a question that was no longer being asked. The third flaw was the cruelest irony. Success poisoned them. After defeating Athens, Sparta found itself administering an empire. Wealth flowed into a society built on austerity. Gold and silver from Persia, tribute from subject cities, the spoils of victory. This terrified Spartan leaders who remembered their founding lawgiver Lycurgus had supposedly banned precious metals to prevent corruption. But you can't unring that bell. Once money entered the system, everything changed. Land, previously distributed equally among citizens, could now be bought and sold. It concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. Wealthy Spartans emerged, then rich Spartans, then aristocrats who owned vast estates while other citizens had nothing. Inequality bred resentment. The rigid cohesion that made Sparta strong began fracturing along economic lines. Men who couldn't afford the contributions required for communal mess halls lost their citizenship status. The population of full citizens shrank not just from war casualties but from poverty. The discipline that defined Sparta relaxed. Why endure the hardships of the Agoge when you could buy luxury? Why sleep on reeds when you could afford a proper bed? The entire system was predicated on equality of suffering. Once that equality dissolved, the system collapsed. And then came the catastrophe they never imagined: military defeat. The year was 371 BCE. The location was Leuctra, a plain in central Greece. The opponent was Thebes, a city-state Spartans had always considered inferior. The Theban general was Epaminondas, a tactical genius facing a Spartan army that included their king and their elite royal guard. Spartan phalanx doctrine called for evenly distributed troop depth, usually 8 to 12 men deep across the entire formation. It was designed to present an uniform wall of shields and spears, grinding down opponents through superior discipline and staying power. Epaminondas did something no one had tried before. He stacked his left flank 50 men deep, a massive column of weight and momentum, and aimed it like a battering ram at the Spartan right, where their king and best warriors were positioned. It should have been suicidal. Conventional tactics said you'd be outflanked, enveloped, destroyed. But Epaminondas counted on Spartan rigidity. He knew they'd fight according to doctrine, refusing to break formation or adapt. He was right. The Theban column smashed into the Spartan right like a sledgehammer hitting glass. The Spartan phalanx, designed to withstand frontal pressure from evenly distributed forces, shattered under concentrated mass. The king died. The royal guard died. 400 Spartans died. For a city-state with maybe 1,500 full citizens remaining, losing 400 in a single afternoon was apocalyptic. And it wasn't just the numbers, it was the myth. Spartans didn't lose land battles. That was their entire identity. The thing that justified all the suffering, all the cruelty, all the sacrifice. At Leuctra, that myth died with their king. Sparta never recovered. They tried. They fought on for years. But their population was too depleted, their mystique too damaged. Other Greek cities that had trembled at the mention of Spartan warriors now saw them as beatable. Revolts erupted. Allies abandoned them. Territory was lost. Within a generation, Sparta was a shadow, a minor city-state clinging to past glory. By the time Rome rose to dominate the Mediterranean, Sparta was a tourist attraction. Romans would visit to watch the ritual whipping at the altar of Artemis Orthia, the same ceremony that had once been a sacred test of courage. Now it was performance, ancient traditions reenacted for foreign spectators who'd pay to see exotic brutality. The Spartans had become a theme park, a living museum of a system that had destroyed itself. Because that's what they'd built, a system so specialized, so extreme, so perfectly calibrated for one specific purpose that it couldn't adapt when circumstances changed. Like a shark that's perfectly evolved for ocean hunting but dies when the ocean dries up. They'd eliminated weakness from their gene pool through infanticide. They'd eliminated compassion through the Agoge. They'd eliminated individuality through constant surveillance and punishment. They'd eliminated love through deliberate separation of families. They'd eliminated moral reasoning by teaching that success justifies everything. And in eliminating all those things they considered weaknesses, they eliminated the flexibility that allows civilizations to survive. They eliminated the creativity that produces innovation. They eliminated the emotional bonds that make people care about the future beyond their own lifespan. They created the perfect warrior. And in doing so, they created a society incapable of being anything other than warriors. When the warrior age passed, when clever tactics defeated brute toughness, when wealth and complexity replaced austere simplicity, Sparta had no answer. The machine that was built to last forever lasted 3 centuries before consuming itself. So what's the lesson here? What are we supposed to take from this? Maybe it's this. Perfection is a trap. The pursuit of human optimization, of eliminating weakness, of creating ideal specimens. It seems logical. Appealing even. Who wouldn't want stronger, smarter, more capable humans? But humans aren't weapons. We're not tools serving a single function. Our messy emotions, our irrational attachments, our stubborn individuality, these aren't bugs in the system. They're features. They're what allows us to adapt, to create, to build societies that can weather change. Sparta tried to perfect humanity, and instead dehumanized it. They built a society where mothers couldn't love their children, where neighbors murdered each other in the night, where your body belonged to the state from before birth until death. They achieved military supremacy for a few generations, and then they vanished, leaving nothing behind but ruins and a warning. The Spartan breeding program was perhaps history's first large-scale attempt at social engineering through reproductive control. It wouldn't be the last. The 20th century saw similar logic applied, different goals, different methods, but the same fundamental premise, that human beings could be improved like livestock, that the state could and should control who reproduces with whom. Those experiments ended the same way Sparta did, in collapse, in horror, in the recognition that trying to perfect humanity requires destroying what makes us human. The Spartans created the deadliest warriors of the ancient world, but they paid for it with everything that makes life worth living, and in the end, even the warriors weren't enough to save them. That's the dark truth behind the legend of the 300. Behind the red capes and the heroic speeches lies a machine designed to manufacture killers, fueled by the sacrifice of everything human, and ultimately incapable of surviving its own success. They were the perfect soldiers, and perfection killed them.